What if physics and consciousness aren't two different subjects at all? What if they're actually two sides of the same coin? Well, today we're diving into a pretty radical new theory of everything that suggests exactly that. It's called Eternal Recursive Manifestation, or ERM for short, and it makes this wild claim that it can unify the entire universe and the human mind into one single, elegant, looping reality. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the massive questions that RM even tries to answer. Then, we'll unpack its core idea, this thing called an infinite feedback loop. From there, we'll get into a concept called the witness operator and see how RM claims it can solve some of the biggest puzzles in science. And finally, we'll hit the most important question for any new theory. Can you actually test it?
All right, before we can even begin to understand the answer ERM is proposing, we have to really frame the problem. And the problem, well, it's made up of the most fundamental questions that have kept scientists and philosophers up at night for centuries.
First up, the biggest one of them all, right? Why is there something instead of nothing? I mean, why does a universe even exist in the first place? This is really the central mystery of existence, the starting point for pretty much any deep question you can ask.
And next, what in the world is consciousness? We all have it, that inner subjective experience, that feeling of being me. But for all our advances, modern science has no real definitive explanation for how it just arises from the physical stuff in our brains. It is genuinely one of the biggest unsolved challenges in all of science.
And that, of course, leads us right to our third big question. How does the mind affect matter? This is the classic mind-body problem. How does a totally non-physical thought in your head, like, I want to pick up that cup, cause your very physical arm to actually move? ERM is this incredibly bold new attempt to answer all three of these huge questions with a single unified idea.
So how does it plan on doing all that? Well, the entire theory is built on one single powerful idea that you actually see everywhere in math and nature: recursion.
So what exactly is recursion? Put simply, it's just a process where the output of one step immediately becomes the input for the very next step. It creates this endless feedback loop. Think about two mirrors facing each other. That infinite tunnel of reflections you see, that's recursion. Or a classic one, when you point a video camera at the TV that's showing its own feed, you get that wild spiraling pattern. That's recursion in action.
And according to the theory of eternal recursive manifestation, at the very, very heart of all reality, there is one simple-looking equation that actually defines this entire cosmic feedback loop.
And there it is, S equals I squared times infinity. Now, it looks pretty basic, right? But trust me, every single component here is packed with meaning. S represents the source, so the totality of everything, all of manifest reality. Okay, let's break down that I squared. Just think of I as raw information, a pattern, a fact. But squaring it, that's the key. That represents the information being observed or reflected upon by some form of awareness. It's the difference between a tree falling in a forest and someone knowing that the tree fell. That act of knowing, that awareness, creates a whole new layer of reality.
And the infinitive symbol? Well, that's exactly what it looks like. It tells us that this recursive feedback loop is eternal. It has no beginning and it has no end. It is just constantly iterating over and over, perpetually generating the reality that we all experience.
But what does it really mean for awareness to reflect upon information? To get specific about that, the theory introduces a mechanism it calls the witness operator.
So ER defines this witness operator, or W, with its own little formula. W equals N composed with R. Now, in math, composed with just means one function acts on the result of another one. So what this is really describing is a two-step process that turns a potential into an actual, concrete reality.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because it breaks awareness down into two incredibly simple steps. Step one is noticing. That's the act of just singling something out, forming a distinction. Imagine a photographer looking through their viewfinder at this huge, endless landscape, and they frame a shot. That's noticing. Step two is recording. This is the irreversible registration of that distinction. That's the photographer clicking the shutter, capturing that one specific frame, and making it a persistent, recorded reality. Okay, so we've got this framework of recursive self-awareness. It's a cool idea, but the real test for any theory of everything is pretty simple. Can it solve the big problems that current science can't?
And this is where the theory really starts to get powerful. For the mind-body problem, ERM says consciousness doesn't have to force a physical outcome with energy. It just chooses the question you ask of a quantum system, which then guides the result without breaking any laws of physics. For the quantum measurement problem, it's that witness operator, that two-step process of noticing and recording, that literally collapses a wave of possibilities into one single concrete reality. And for the hard problem of consciousness, ERM just flips the whole script. It says the brain doesn't create awareness. It's more like an antenna that receives and amplifies a consciousness that's already fundamental to the universe.
This quote from the source material really just nails that last point. The brain does not generate awareness. It amplifies distributed awareness into coherent fields. So, in this view, awareness is a fundamental property of the universe, just like spacetime. Our brains are just these incredibly complex receivers, tuning into that universal awareness and focusing it into the coherent, personal experience we all call I.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. This is all a really fascinating, elegant idea. But does it cross that crucial line from being just philosophy into being actual science? I mean, to do that, it has to be testable. It needs to make predictions that could, at least in principle, be proven wrong.
And crucially, the theory says, yes, it is. It actually proposes 3 specific kinds of experiments. So at the quantum level, you could test to see if an observer's brainwave coherence actually correlates with the outcomes of quantum measurements. Neurobiologically, you could try to disrupt the brain's recursive loops to see if consciousness completely vanishes or if it just becomes less coherent. And finally, on a cosmic scale, you could search for data that contradicts the standard heat-death model of the universe. You know, the idea that everything will eventually run out of energy and just fade to black. ERM would predict something very, very different.
And so all of this leaves us with a final, pretty profound thought. If a theory like ERM is even remotely on the right track, it completely reframes our place in the cosmos. It suggests that we're not just random accidents in some meaningless universe, but that we are fundamental participants in an eternal, self-creating, self-watching reality. So the final question is, are we, in essence, the universe observing itself? That is definitely a question worth pondering.